title of the lecture, which you can see. And the lecture is based on our photographic collection. For those who may visited our website, www.pilsduski.org, when you get there, you will see that there are more than 2,000 photographs digitized, which can be used without any cost. So here today, you will see 57 of them regarding Jozef Pilsudski, who is for everyone from Poland, the main person responsible for getting Poland independence back. He's the father of our independence. And we are approaching Polish Independence Day, which will be shortly on November 11th. So I'm very glad that today we have this event. And I would like to also say that this event and this program is supported in part by funds, public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would like to introduce our guest. Dr. Jacek Czarnecki has been an assistant professor at Kingsborough Community College since 2014. He's also associated with our institute as a board member and on the executive committee since 2019 in the capacity of secretary of the board. Dr. Czarnecki holds a Doctor of Arts degree from St. John's University with a concentration in world history and global connections. So he is academic teacher, scholar, and he will be talking to you about Pilsudski. For those who are here first time, maybe if you have any questions, we can speak after the lecture and we can show you around or answer whatever questions you have. And I would like to also say that shortly, in a few weeks, we'll have other great events which I will announce later on. So now I will give the floor to Jacek, and we are ready for the lecture. Should I take off the lights? I mean, turn off? Or this is good for you, like this?
Yes.
Let's try and see for...
Better.
Oh, it's better. It's
Yes.
better. Okay, good.
Complete darkness would be better, so no one sees me. Then I would feel comfortable. But good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight. It's good to be among you, especially after 2.5 years of teaching from my basement on Zoom. It's nice to get out. So, like Dr. Korga said, there's over 2,000 digitalized images on the website. So the focus of this evening was to present as many as I could ultimately and still make it within an hour of a lecture or so. So I have chosen 57. If I will get through all of them in the next hour, we are breaking records tonight because it's difficult to get through 57 slides in an hour. I mean, this will be the first for me at least. But at least I wanted to show you as much of interesting things as I possibly could within the next hour or so. So today we're going to take a look at two things. First, we're going to take a look at Jozef Pilsudski. So ultimately, we cannot talk about Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s without actually looking at this man himself. And the second thing is we're going to a little bit talk about the Second Polish Republic, which I feel has not gotten the attention or the love that it really deserves over the years. And it has especially been revolved in a lot of myths, misinformations, misunderstandings for various reasons, but probably one of the most famous ones is Polish cavalry charging at German tanks, German armor during World War II, which is just ridiculous. But nevertheless, that was a very strong myth, which ultimately you found in a lot of books, academic and popular books. And I think in recent years, this has been debunked. Today, very few people sort of really believe in that on face value, which is good. But the idea of Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s being a weak country, having an outdated military that relies on horses, and not being prepared for the German invasion in 1939, I believe still consists, unfairly. And so at least I wanted to take a little bit of sort of time to talk about a few things dealing with the Second Polish Republic. So I hope you don't mind. Here I just kind of have 57 slides, so I just numbered which one is which. I wish I was smart enough to sort of remember all 57 in order. So first, we're going to take a look at Jozef Pilsudski. And usually when people talk about Jozef Pilsudski, or you have lectures about him, or articles about him, usually the person who is quoted is a Polish poet called Jan Lech. Ultimately, he said about Pilsudski that men like Jozef Pilsudski are not born into this world to be like a glow of a meteor at night and then leave darkness behind. But rather they are given to nations to be eternal life, eternal light, like guideposts ultimately. And after their death are their greatest victories. I kind of like that because ultimately it does remind me of one of the earliest writings that we have of human beings. And that came from Mesopotamia, 2000 BCE, so about 4,000 years ago. We have sort of clay tablets, and on them we have a story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And ultimately, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have a king of the city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, what today is modern-day Iraq. And he's not really a good king to the people. He's kind of crappy. But ultimately, one day, he goes on a journey to try to look for eternal life. He wants to live forever. And so as he's going on this journey, he actually has a lot of things happen to him. It's a lot of information on those clay tablets. But ultimately, he was able to get a hold of eternal life a few times. He had it in his hands. And then one of the last times he had it, and then he fell asleep and he let it go. But ultimately, the moral of this story is that it's not possible. It's not possible to live forever. And he realized that the only way to live forever, really, is through the memory and the hearts of others that you leave behind. And that is kind of a clear connection to the poet of Jan Lech. 4,000 years difference, and yet the same message. We really, as human beings, we need inspirations. We need examples. And somebody like Jozef Pilsudski comes along, he is just that. Somebody who will last forever. I mean, years from now, we will still be talking about him. It's impossible if we talk about 1920s and 1930s Poland. And so, now that my computer has shut off, there you go. Perfect time. So, Jozef Pilsudski, probably one of the most recognized faces in Polish history. I think, a fascinating person. A person who does have his flaws. Ultimately, I think many times we look at history and we like to romanticize it. We look at history as black and white, and that's not what history is. Once you realize how complicated history is, how things sort of mix together, that, I think, is what makes it interesting. At that point, we really can relate to it. We can understand it. We could sort of take examples from it. So even looking at somebody like Jozef Pilsudski, a great man, ultimately, without him, Poland would most likely not exist in the 1920s. And yet, having his flaws, like smoking. You always see him smoking. I mean, he was a heavy smoker. And this is why for many years of his life, he had a lot of breathing problems, what today we would probably call COPD, but essentially restriction of airflow to the lungs. But taking aside sort of the heavy smoking, he did some controversial things that we still talk about today, like the May coup of 1926, which we are still discussing. Or even when you look at his private life, the truth is he was never really able to be faithful to a woman he loved, except his mother. His mother he loved dearly to the end of his days. But like his two wives, his lovers, there was always sort of a point of betrayal, and they still loved him. And that kind of shows, just a fascination with his character, ultimately. But born in Zulów, what modern day is Lithuania, 1867. Here you have him with his brother, Bronisław, I believe, because his brother was born a year before, so he's 7 years old. So here it is at a young age. He grew up in a very, very patriotic home. I mean, his father was involved in the January uprising of 1863. So that was sort of an uprising, mainly in sort of like the Polish lands under Russian control, because Poland during this time period is divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So this was mainly in the Russian lands, ultimately, in 1863. And certainly a lot of these very patriotic values were put into him by his mother as well. Ultimately, many times he even said this, that, when he was young, they were scaring the young kids with Muscovites, right? So sort of like today, we would say the boogeyman is coming, Muma, ghosts, right? Go to sleep. So ultimately, they would sort of scare the kids with Muscovites, Russians, essentially. And so it's kind of, no surprise that growing up, being a teenager, his hero became Tadeusz Kościuszko, another famous Pole who ultimately fought for not just Polish independence, but even in the American Revolution, so American Revolution as well. But again, he had his struggles in life as well. For example, when he was 17 years old, his mother died. So his mother at this time was 42, very young age. But ultimately, this had a very powerful impact on him. I mean, this was the person that he loved the most. And so to lose a mother at the age of 17 definitely had to be sort of a difficult time for him. And so, being young, he tried a few things. At one point, he goes to college, he tries to study medicine. That doesn't work out after a year or so. And very quickly, he gets involved in sort of different underground movements. Sort of these movements, the whole point of them was to sort of, gain independence for Poland, ultimately. And here he is, with a beard. He's the one holding the head, ultimately. I mean, this is a pretty rare picture, because Pilsudski is famous for his mustache. And here he is with a beard, which he had until December 1914. So only in 1914 he will shave this thing off. So it's kind of very strange to see him like this. And many people wouldn't even recognize him, ultimately, when looking at a photograph like this. But here you guys see him sort of being involved in groups. And ultimately, one of the things they wanted to do is perform what I guess today we would call sort of terrorist acts against the Russian Tsar. So at one point he was involved in an incident where ultimately they were plotting to kill Tsar Alexander III. Alexander III, right? So Tsar Alexander III. So this plot failed. And ultimately, his brother, Bronisław, got 15 years in Katorga. He got 5 years in Siberia. And this is actually the moment that Lenin's brother got executed. So they were actually working together in the same group that you ultimately have Lenin's brother. Sort of Lenin then becoming the leader of the Russian Revolution in 1917. So ultimately, his brother, again, was sent to a Katorga. Katorga was really a hardcore sort of prison system inside of Russia. I mean, then when you guys have the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik taking over, that was transformed into the Gulag. And then ultimately Gulag is very famous under Stalin. In the 1930s and 40s, 50s, millions of people went through the Gulag system. So when you spend years in the Katorga, you didn't come back the same person. This was brutal, this was harsh. Pilsudski was sent to Siberia, sort of exiled to Siberia for 5 years. This was a lot more gentle. Because ultimately, like looking even at his memoirs and the memoirs of many people, probably the biggest problem was boredom. They were really bored. They didn't have to do sort of this very hard labor that people in those prison camps had to do, like his father, for example. But this is ultimately where he spent 5 years of his life. This is where he fell in love for the first time with Leona Lewandowska, which unfortunately he will break her heart. This is also where he picked up his habit of drinking strong, sweet tea. And supposedly this is the only thing he was able to do in the kitchen, make tea. And that's the only thing he did. But I love this image because you guys see this tea. When you look at it, it's like Coca-Cola. It's like coffee. I mean, he really loved drinking this very strong. And supposedly he was able to drink as much as 10 cups a day. So no wonder he never slept. It's like drinking 10 Starbucks today. But as you guys see right here, this is a habit that he always had all the way until the end of his life. This is also the moment that ultimately, when he was there, he got into an altercation with a guard. He got headbutted with a rifle and he lost his front 2 teeth. And this is why ultimately he always had this very bushy mustache to really sort of cover up the missing teeth in the front. So, when he left Siberia, eventually he made his way to the Polish lands. Eventually he met a different woman, Maria, and ultimately he married her. So Leonardo's heart was broken at that point. And then ultimately he left Maria for his second wife, Alexandra. So his personal life is a little bit of a mess. Nevertheless, they adored him. And this is why I chose in this picture. You could see the pride in his wife's face. And this is really what every single woman that he was with sort of thought about him. So even though they knew he was betraying them, he was not honest with them, they never said anything bad about them. When you even read sort of the diaries, not one thing was mentioning about him that's bad. He was always presented as a good husband, as a good man. And that's just fascinating. But that kind of shows you the complexity of this man and the relationships that he had, sort of even with the women during this time period. And then, of course, his beloved horse, Kasztanka. Kasztanka, I'm sorry, I said Kasztanka. So, that relationship is not just with women, it then translates into the horse itself. Because supposedly this horse has a pretty bad attitude. He, for example, didn't like artillery firing or anything like that. Which really freaks out horses. They don't like loud sounds. But when Pilsudski was on him, he was always calm. He always listened to him. Which you guys do see with horses, with dogs. They're pack animals. They follow a leader. But nevertheless, it takes years to develop that relationship. And he was able to sort of have it even with the horse itself on the battlefield, with the noise, with the sounds. Again, it sounds so simple, so primitive, and yet when you sort of really understand this, it's so complex. And it takes years to sort of develop that relationship. So the horse itself was born probably 1908, 1909. Died 1927 from what I remember. But ultimately, the horse served him all throughout sort of the events of World War I. So, when Pilsudski left Siberia, he was still involved in sort of these underground movements and groups. His goal, his main purpose in life was to have a free Poland, ultimately. And he tried this in many different ways. For example, already in 1904, 1905, he tried to create the Polish legions in Japan, because Russia was fighting Japan during that time period. So he tried Japan. That didn't work. Then in 1908, he tried the city of Vilna. That kind of worked because by the time you guys have World War I, about 7,000 members already belonging to that organization. So it kind of expanded pretty nicely. And when World War I did break out, of course, he was on the side of Austro-Hungarian armies and Germany. So ultimately, he was on the side of the Central Powers. Because ultimately, he believed that the best path to take in order to have a free Poland is to defeat Russia. So ultimately, during this time period, you guys have Germany and Austria fighting the Russian Empire. And so the defeat of Russia was his path forward to gain independence for Poland. However, by about the middle of World War I, it kind of becomes obvious that Germany and Austria-Hungary will probably lose. And so at that point, he begins to kind of now has a change of strategy, ultimately. Instead of kind of being on the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany, he refuses to take the oath of allegiance to the German army and the Austrian army. And a lot of his supporters as well. And that is why he ends up in prison for a second time. In 1917, the Germans throw him in prison because he didn't take the oath. He's not promising to be loyal to the Central Powers ultimately. And when he is in prison in 1917, this is where he picked up this habit, playing cards. Solitaire was his game. And ultimately, when he was in prison, he was treated very well. He stayed in sort of like an officer's house, so he wasn't like a prisoner. Again, his biggest problem was just being bored by himself, loneliness. That was his problem. However, at one point, he did get sort of like a friend, a roommate, as a prisoner, Kazimierz Sosnowski. And they also played a game, chess, but supposedly Pilsudski lost. And so he never played chess ever again. I get it, I hate to lose as well. But the cards remained with him. He ultimately said that this is really what relaxes him. One side of his brain is being relaxed, as the other one is concentrating on the game itself. But while he was in prison, the reality of Poland being independent, free, was actually becoming very realistic at that point. I mean, already you guys see this image, 1916. This is when the Polish legions, Polish armies are going into the city of Pilsudski, which is awesome. I was there this August. So I was kind of excited. My wife said, you're crazy. But you already see sort of, the excitement in 1916 and the serious possibility of that there might be an independent Poland. Especially when you see images like this, Chicago. This is volunteers going in to fight for Poland into Europe. And we believe anywhere between 20 to 25,000 volunteered to ultimately go into World War I to fight for independent Poland during this time period. A lot of them ended up in France, in what was called the Haller Army, or sometimes referred to as the Blue Army because of the color blue in the uniforms, ultimately. So this Polish unit inside of the French armies was really something special and important because at the end of World War I, they were really sort of an independent Polish army within France in a way. And eventually when Poland gets independence, they will be transferred into Poland, which is a big deal because they will come with equipment like tanks, the FT-14, sort of light, small tank. Heck, it's even a tankette. It's a small tank, it sucks, but still, it becomes very important fighting the Bolsheviks in 1919, 1920. So ultimately, this is going to have sort of a big importance in the next few years. And then, World War I comes to an end, Pilsudski leaves jail, Poland is reborn on a map of Europe again after 123 years of ultimately not existing there. But at this point, Pilsudski just gets already a legendary reputation. Not just a reputation of somebody who dedicated his life, his career, everything for Poland to be reborn, a politician, a statesman, but also a military leader, ultimately. And so his status becomes really legendary, especially what kind of helps him is being in jail in 1917, because a lot of people were beginning to draw in sort of symbolism to that. Poland doesn't exist. Just like Pilsudski is in jail, right? Both of them have no freedom, no independence. But just like Pilsudski came out of jail, Poland was reborn. And you could sort of make a lot of symbolisms with that. It could really play into a lot of, hearts if you sort of start making these connections of his life, his suffering, and the suffering of the nation and the people. And it becomes really sort of interesting at that point. So people already sort of adored him, and he actually makes very important decisions right away. Because when he got into Warsaw, the capital really, one of the first things he did was kind of fast forward, expedite this process of really sort of kicking out German soldiers. Because here you guys have a very weird situation. World War I is over, and yet there is still about 80,000 German soldiers in Polish lands. So this kind of became a very tricky situation. Towards the end of World War I, orders, discipline begins to break down, so you do have rapes, robberies, things like that. You really don't want 80,000 foreign troops in your land, ultimately. So he was very helpful in sort of making sure that they leave as quickly as possible, and he made it very easy for them to do so, but they had to leave their military equipment behind. If they did that, out you go. But you already sort of see images like this. This is in the city of Białystok, 1921. I mean, I know it's very difficult, especially from far away, but you guys have this online. And so you can zoom in. And really what I love to usually do is zoom in on the faces, and you begin to see the excitement. There's even Pilsudski's image right there in the background on the second floor, or I guess first floor, right, because we're in Poland. But you even see Pilsudski's sort of image right there. So you really see that admiration that people have during this time period. And this is sort of where he finally settles down with his second wife, who he marries in 1921. And the only reason he married her is because in 1921 his first wife died, Maria. And so then it kind of allowed him to marry Alexandra, because Maria didn't want to give him divorce. So she knew he is with somebody else, but she still didn't want to let go of him. She still loved him. That's kind of fascinating. But in 1921, he marries Alexandra. By that time, they already had the two daughters, Wanda and Jadwiga. So Wanda was the older one. Jadwiga is the younger one. Here's another image of them. Man, I love that. I mean, take a look at these kids reading books. If I could get my 3-year-old son to do this, that would be awesome. He's getting there. But I know this is probably done for a picture itself, but still, that's pretty good. But yeah, his daughters, Wanda and Jadwiga. So Wanda, essentially after World War II, got her degree in medicine and became a psychiatrist. She died in 2001, I think I saw last time, if I'm not mistaken. And then her younger daughter, Jadwiga, actually became a pilot, sort of during World War II. So she was a pilot of the Air Transport Auxiliary for the British. So essentially these pilots were responsible for transporting medicine and troops from point A to point B and supplies. So they wouldn't go into battle sort of on the front lines, but they would sort of transport, which is still a dangerous job, don't get me wrong. So she was a pilot, and I believe she died recently, 2014, or I remember this, 2014, I believe, the year I got my doctorate. So that's the man, the legend, Pilsudski, and then ultimately he passes away in 1935. And you have a lot of images from his funeral on website, which are just beautiful pictures. This is in Warsaw, his body being carried through the streets. And then this one is through Krakow, because ultimately this is where he is buried. Except his brain, which was dedicated to science, and his heart, which stayed with his mom in the city of Vilna. So here is sort of a procession of his heart. So technically sort of like 3 funeral processions for one man. But ultimately, he said in his testament that the body of his mother should be transferred to Vilna as well, and ultimately he wanted his heart to be next to his mother. Like I told you, one woman that he was always loyal to until the end of his days, that was his mother. Ultimately, he said that his mother prepared him for this role that he had, for a leader of Poland, and that a proud heart should rest next to the feet of the proud mother. And so his heart was ultimately buried in the city of Vilna. But the Second Polish Republic, here's where I just kind of wanted to write a few things for myself, because it's not that easy to memorize all these numbers. But ultimately, the Second Polish Republic was born in a very difficult circumstance. And I think a lot of times people sort of forget this situation. So, during World War I, basically the Eastern Front ran through Polish lands, ultimately. And it was common practice for roads, railways, buildings, for everything sort of to be destroyed by the retreating armies, by the retreating troops. So ultimately, by the end of World War I, you guys are looking at a situation where Poland had about 40% of its large bridges destroyed. 63% of its railroad stations. 75% of Poles were unemployed. 3 out of 4 people don't work. A third, so about 35% of its cattle and horses are dead. And this is where you get a lot of misunderstandings, because ultimately what happened in the 1920s and 30s is Poland put a very big focus on horses to get that number up as quickly as possible. And here people say, well, this was for the Polish cavalry, the military. No. Essentially, you have to realize that horses were very important for transport, for farmers, for agriculture, and 35% of them are dead. So you need to get those numbers up, ultimately, if you really want to have a functioning economy. So not really kind of dealing with the military, really. I mean, don't get me wrong, the military also needs them for transport. But it's not because they believe that the horse is the future or anything like that. And that's another misconception that a lot of times people have. Close to 40% of its buildings were destroyed. And, a shocking one, about 15% of the population is dead, which is a number comparable to World War II. During World War II, about 18% of Polish people died. So during World War I, 15%. I mean, that's an enormous number, ultimately. So the destruction itself is just unbelievable. To now create a nation in that situation, I mean, the odds against you are enormous. But that's not the end. Ultimately, almost right away, Poland got itself involved in a war with Soviet Russia. 1919, 1920, 1921, vicious war, ultimately. So as Europe, countries like Britain and France were sort of able to now transfer everything to peacetime and sort of, downgrade their militaries and everything like that, their budgets for the war, Poland remained fighting basically for its borders. I mean, the big problem at the end of World War I was that the treaties said very clearly the western borders of Poland with Germany, but they didn't do so with the eastern borders. And ultimately that erupted in a lot of violence and fightings, not just with Russia, but ultimately with everybody. In fact, Poland in the 1920s and 30s really just had a good relationship with Latvia, the small country of Latvia, and Romania. So here you guys have Pilsudski with the king of Romania, Ferdinand I, I believe. So only these two countries. So that's difficult as well because, well, how are you going to come up with agreements, with trade, with business? I mean, that in itself was very difficult because countries like Lithuania, there is tension that is unbelievable. Poland had trade wars with Germany ultimately, and that was putting a lot of pressure on the economy itself. So here's kind of that other issue. World War I, the destruction of the war, then you sort of end up fighting the Bolsheviks. And believe me, Poland was the only one fighting the Bolsheviks. They were left on their own. I mean, yeah, France gave them money, but the money that they gave them was basically, that money during World War I, you guys would spend in one day. That's how much money they got. And America gave them some loans and things like that. But in general, Poland was really left on its own to fight Russia. And they were able to stop them, the invasion, and win. And this was important. In fact, this was probably one of the more important wars in European history because Poland was able to stop the spread of communism. Ultimately, the main point of this invasion was to spread communism. Go along with the ideas of the founding father of communism, Karl Marx and Lenin, a worldwide socialist revolution. It's not so much about Poland. I mean, ultimately, Lenin probably thought that he would be welcomed with flowers in Poland, like Russia today in Ukraine. So it wasn't so much about Poland, it was Germany. It was sort of to link up, to get to Germany, get with those factory workers in Germany, and here you're going to sort of spread the communist revolution. Russia is the beating heart, the center, the origins, and then Germany. And then you guys will go from Germany to Britain, to Italy, America. And so you're looking at a worldwide communist revolution. So this war was essentially very important because they stopped that, ultimately. Lenin had to try different ways, so he creates organizations like the Comintern and this and that. None of that works, ultimately. And then Stalin gets there, and Stalin is Stalin. He's a dictator. So ultimately, he wanted the power of the Soviet Union. He wasn't such a big believer like Lenin in these world socialist revolutions. I have to start. So that in itself was an important war, but that's not the end. So we're just talking about sort of the military aspect of this. And even when you guys talk about the military aspect of this, you have to realize how hectic this was. I mean, there was no standard uniforms. There was no weapons that were standardized. You guys have to realize that the Polish soldiers had basically weapons from 4 countries. They had it from France, from Germany, Austria, and Russia. Who did I miss? Germany, Austria, Russia, France. 4.
Yeah.
So, and all of these weapons are using different ammunitions. So how do you even supply the soldiers at battle? How do you even do this, logistically speaking? Where ultimately sort of, you might have a situation where the same unit, the same group of soldiers have 4 different weapons, 4 different ammunitions. They were trained differently. They have different uniforms, different ranks. And now you have to make sense of that. And you can't, because you're fighting Russia. This was a very sort of difficult situation. But again, that's not even the end. You guys have to now fight the Ukrainians, because ultimately there were Ukrainian groups who ultimately performed various sabotages and terrorist acts ultimately, so there were tensions there. And there was one more thing that was really nothing that Poland can do about it. You see, what happened at the end of World War I is Europe had this time period of what's called hyperinflations, where just inflation becomes out of control. So we live in inflation. I go to Key Food, I used to spend $100, now I spend $150, and I curse all the way back home. That's inflation. Prices go up. It sucks. In 1920, the inflation rose up by millions. Millions. In a country like Germany, billions. To give you guys an example, in 1919, $1 was about 4.2 German marks. So 1 to 4 ratio, right? $1, 4 German marks. At the height of hyperinflation, November 1923, $1 would get you 4 trillion German marks. The point is, money became worthless. People used to burn money. Kids played with money. Money is simply worthless. Poland got sucked into these hyperinflations. There was no way out of it. A new nation, a new country, you gotta rebuild everything. You're fighting a war with Russia, and sort of the economies collapsed in Europe. That's the situation that Poland was in. All the odds, honestly, were against it. So sort of once you begin to realize that, you slowly begin to realize why certain people, like Pilsudski, were important. You know, and this is where you have to sort of give him a lot of credit. You have to sort of, on some level then, compare him to like George Washington. You know, sort of in America. I mean, an inspirational leader. I'll be honest with you guys. America got its independence, great, but they were a mess. They had no government, they had no military, they had nothing. They were a complete mess. But you know one thing that they all agree with? Washington is awesome. No matter who you guys were, you had respect for Washington. Washington didn't want to be a president. He wanted to retire. He wanted to go to his plantations, spend the days with his wife, not be a president. He got sucked into it. He basically didn't want that, but people wanted him because they knew that he is really the only person with the amount of respect and loyalty that everybody has towards him. And really only him can sort of lead the nation during that time period. You can sort of look at Pilsudski that way as well. Again, you have sort of these controversial moments like the May coup of 1926 and things like that, but without a doubt, if you sort of look at Poland and the Polish nation, the amount of respect that he has is just unbelievable. And you really sort of need a leader like that during these times. Otherwise, the odds are truly against the country itself. But it's even beyond Pilsudski. And this is why I always feel like the Second Polish Republic doesn't get enough credit. Because as you guys see, I just touched upon a tip of an iceberg when it comes to issues and problems. And yet, what Poland will be able to do in 20 years is just unbelievable. For example, it will be a nation in Europe that will come out of these hyperinflations the best and the fastest out of any other country, like even Germany. So sort of when you guys look at unemployment, money, everything else, Poland sort of surpassed other European countries coming out of that economic chaos. By 1929, 95% of kids are in school, which is just an awesome achievement. The Royal Castle in Warsaw is rebuilt. Various museums, libraries across the country essentially open up. Just tremendous sort of achievements during this time period. And this is sort of where I kind of also wanted to show you guys a few pictures from this time period. Like, for example, this is Dunajec. I lost my... I just want to make sure. Yeah, it's Dunajec. So this is southern Poland. Beautiful. This is, for example, the city of Lwów, today Ukraine. This is the city of Pinsk, so today in Belarus. And of course, the city of Poznan, western Poland, straight shoot into Berlin, basically, from Poznan. And Warsaw. I love pictures of Warsaw, because during World War II, close to 90% of the street of the city was destroyed, leveled with the ground. So ultimately, to look at these pictures is amazing. To look into history that you cannot see no more. It's not there, it was destroyed. So beautiful sort of images from Warsaw itself that you guys can take a look at online from the 1920s and 30s. Here's, for example, building a railroad bridge for trains. And here's the city of Łódź, which kind of shows you the industry. So in Poland, not being backward, it's not like sort of their country of just farmlands. You really see that industry sort of kicking in, especially in the 1930s when Poland sort of begins to build this sort of central industrial complex, which Łódź was part of sort of that city. So industry is sort of booming in the 1930s. And of course, the city of Gdynia. This in itself is an unbelievable accomplishment. You see, at the end of World War I, you have the city of Gdańsk. But the problem of the city of Gdańsk is it wasn't Polish. It was an international city under the control of the League of Nations. So the point is, Poland could have used it, they traded through there, they had special sort of privileges with certain things, but it wasn't Poland. And so ultimately, Poland has to now build a new city, a new port, and that was Gdynia. Before World War I, Gdynia was a freaking fishing village. I mean, small little fishing village. And then when you look at the city in the 1930s, I mean, that in itself is unbelievably impressive, because by 1930s, Gdynia is one of the most important ports in Europe. Not Poland, but in Europe, ultimately. So sort of to do this in about 15 years, that in itself is just very great achievement. But it kind of goes beyond just building cities, building the infrastructure. We also have to talk about the military itself. Again, there's this perception that, going into World War II, Poland held on to sort of these values and beliefs of horses and 1860s and Napoleon and things like that. Nonsense. That's just ridiculous. Here's Polish soldiers, well, not Polish soldiers, but Polish legions, so Poles fighting for Germany or Austria. Here they are with artillery during World War I. Here they are with a machine gun in World War I. Here you have Pilsudski in the trenches of World War I. The point is, they knew what war looks like. They knew what the future is. They knew about the technology. They used machine guns. They used artillery. They have bled in the trenches. There is no way that this is how they are now going to move on into the future of sort of building their military based on horses and fighting in these traditional ways that sometimes people sort of say they're fighting in. But even though you know what you have to do, then you have the reality. And for Poland, the reality was simply money. Right? So this is why ultimately many times you have to rely on things like horses for certain things like transportation, because ultimately you just don't have the budget for cars. Right? And so, like I mentioned, it's not just because Poland doesn't have the money. They have the hyperinflations in the 1920s, 1929 Great Depression. Another worldwide economic disaster that lasts for about 3-4 years. So you have to sort of somehow bulk up those numbers somehow, because the French and the British weren't really giving you loans. They gave Poland a tremendously hard time in terms of getting money and supplies from them. Like at one point, Poland wanted to get the newest French tank, the Soma S-35. The French said no. And so ultimately, Poles had no choice. They had to get some crappier tanks because they knew that the Germans are about to attack. And then sort of you have historians sort of blaming Poland. Oh, look at these tanks that they got. Well, they had no other option. And so ultimately, sort of even when you guys look at the military, it's impressive what Poland was able to achieve. They had very good weapons. Like for example, they had the Marszałek WZ-35. It was an anti-tank gun. That was one of the best anti-tank guns in the world. It was able to penetrate and destroy any German tank on the field at that time. It's forgotten. People don't talk about it. Poland had WZ-36 Bofors, which were Swedish, by the way. They were a very good sort of weapon on the battlefield. They had the P-37 Wash bombers. Again, one of the best medium bombers in the world. The problem was in terms of how to use them, but they were there. The 7TP light tank, which is better tank than the Germans. Usually I think sometimes people forget that the German tanks of 1939 are so much different than the German tanks of 1942, 43, 44. People talk about the German Panzer tanks and the Tiger tanks. These things really began to operate in 1942, 43. They came in many different versions. So the best version is J. That came much later. Basically, the tanks that Germany had in 1939, Poland could have knocked them out with the sort of equipment that they had. That was not a problem. The problem was that there was just not enough equipment. Sort of the industry was not good enough to sort of do that ultimately during that time period. And there was a lot of sort of plans for the future. I mean, when you guys see what kind of things they were planning, they would have actually made a very good military. Like for example, the Jastrząb some planes, which were just prototypes at that time. They had a 10 TP tank, which was supposed to be a medium tank. That was a kick-ass tank. It would have been one of the best tanks in the world. But again, the problem is it was only in the prototype stages at that time. So they needed about 2-3 more years to really put everything into production. If they did, the war would have been much different in 1939 if they were sort of around. And then also when you guys look at the cavalry, you know, everybody sort of thinks that Poland relied on cavalry, but in 1937, only about 14% of the Polish military was cavalry. Horses on men, yeah. Men on horses. 14%, which is a lot. You might think it's not, but it's still a lot. However, by 1939, that number is 8%. So it's very clear it's dropping, right? Like I mentioned to you, Poland simply just doesn't have the industry to catch up as quickly as Germany, so they have to kind of beef up sort of their ranks somehow, so that was done with cavalry. But as you see, as the years go along, the cavalry was essentially changing into modernized, mechanized units like all the other armies. America, Germany, everybody was doing the same thing at the same time. The only difference is, in 1939, Poland simply didn't have the industry to do it as quickly as Germany in 1938. That was the only difference. You know, so definitely when you even look at their military, they were not being left behind. And you guys can also see some of these things in the images. Again, Pilsudski, Białystok, 1921. Sort of that moment that I showed you earlier. Here he is coming into the city in carriage, on a horse. Oh, I know, beginnings. But by 1930s, Pilsudski's in the car. I mean, you know, Poland really sort of made great improvements. Pilsudski's in the car. When you sort of look at the president of Poland, they're traveling by cars, not horses. That's out of the picture. So this is something that kind of people don't realize once they look at these images. But you could definitely see that progression from the 1920s to the 1930s in terms of even simple things like that, ultimately. But like I said, 20 years was just not long enough to really catch up with Germany. I think that many times people think that Germany is sort of like this weak country because they were defeated at the end of World War I. And one thing people forget is that at the end of World War I, even though Germany was defeated, they still had the strongest industry in Europe. They had the best potential in Europe, not Britain, Germany. So to catch up with a country like that in 15, 20 years, honestly, it's unrealistic, no matter how good you are, ultimately during this time period. So unfortunately, September 1st, 1939, the bombing of Poland, Gdańsk. So you have a lot of images with that, dealing with sort of World War I. Polish soldiers, Polish boys, once again have to go into battle to defend Poland, ultimately. And it's a tough battle. Here you guys see an image of Poland, obviously. Of Warsaw, the city of Warsaw bombarded, sort of in 1939. But these are more difficult images to look at. In fact, as a historian, sort of when I go through archives and I do come across images like this, it's hard. I think many times people come to these lectures, like even my students, and I talk about numbers and things like that. It's so hard to picture that. Like 6 million people died. I mean, do you really understand that? Right? I mean, these numbers are so big, it just goes over the head. It's something you have to memorize for an exam. And so I guess Stalin was onto something when he coldly said that one death is a tragedy, a million, just a statistic. But there's something to it, right? Somebody close to you dies, holy crap, it changes your life. Here I am telling you 15% of Poles died in World War I. That's a number that goes over your head. But images like that kind of, I think, sometimes bring in closer to your life, ultimately. When you sort of look at the daughters, the wives, the husbands dead, and you actually see the victims laying on the ground after bombardments, after sort of the front lines attacks and things like that. So very difficult images to look like, but I also think very important. And it's a bad word, but it's so cool that these images are up online. Again, not cool, but you know what I mean. It just kind of makes people realize how truly horrific this was, ultimately, during that time period. Here is Poland surrendering. Warsaw surrendering. Poland never surrendered, by the way, during World War II. So here is the capitulation of, essentially, Warsaw. In September 28th, 1939, Warsaw surrenders. But again, Poland doesn't surrender. Ultimately, Polish armies, Polish men go out, and now they will be fighting along the side of the British, of the French. So here you guys have an image of Sikorski, who sort of became the commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces, inspecting the troops in France. So Poland is going to be still fighting on land, on water. This is a cool image, because this is actually the ship of Gryf. Yeah, Gryf. So this ship was actually destroyed on September 3rd, 1939. It was one of the newest ships in the world. I believe it went into service 1936, somewhere along that, 36, 37. So this was really sort of one of the newest ships that Poland had at that time, and it was destroyed on September 3rd, 1939. This ship was not. Burza. So this ship actually escaped, and it fought along the side of the British all the way until the end of World War II. So I'm guessing this image is probably like 1942, 43, just simply of the painting. This is sort of British. It's not, Poland didn't have this type of a painting on ships. But anyway, it fought along the side of the British until the end of World War I, and I believe it was in commission until 1960. So Poland fought at sea, in air. This is a kick-ass sort of image of a plane. And the turret right there, I don't know what plane this is, but that turret right there in the front makes me believe that this is actually a B-17 Flying Fortress, which was a badass bomber during World War II. I mean, the Americans produced this, and they produced over 12,000 of these during World War II, so awesome. What you see, sort of, the Polish insignia. So sea, land, really everywhere. This is the army of Anders in Iran. So sort of Polish prisoners who were in Russia were freed, in the Soviet Union they were freed, and here you guys have them regrouping in Middle East, in places like Iraq, places like Iran. So here you even have them sort of fighting in the Middle East itself. So that's kind of interesting and inspiring on its own to sort of see all of this. So, 48 minutes. I hope you don't mind, just 10 minutes. I know your backs hurt, your butts hurt. I know these chairs. But 10 minutes, because ultimately I'm done with certain things I wanted to tell you, but I just want to point out like 10 more pictures that I just kind of want to open up your imaginations when you sort of would look at them. Like this one. Not Pilsudski, not the group itself, but the mustache. I mean, many times when you guys sort of look at pictures from 1920s, 1930s, guys would have sort of like a mustache under the nose, right? I mean, like Hitler. But this was a popular trend. And ultimately, really, it kind of goes into World War I. World War I was really the first war where there was clear discipline of men having to keep no facial hair. Or at least very, very, like this, very small facial hair. So, you know, fighting in those trenches for 3-4 years, a lot of men sort of fell into that kind of habit. And at the end of World War I, they still wanted to sort of, you know, shave and keep clean. This is, I think, really sort of like the first time that men sort of begin to care about their faces, in a way. So it really kind of comes in from World War I. And the other practical reason for that is you need to have no facial hair because of a gas mask. You know, during World War I, poisonous gas was used widely. Mustard gas, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, which was the deadliest. And so you needed to make sure that the seal around your face is really tight. You can't do that with facial hair. But if you still want to hold on to some hair, a mustache under your nose. So a lot of the images that you see, you sort of see these kind of, you know, mustaches or clean-shaven people, very few beards. So sometimes, you know, when you look at these images, kind of think wider. Or even women. I mean, this is the floppers, for crying out loud, right? There's this kind of influence of Western women coming out of America, coming out of Britain, the flopper, right? Women cut their hair short into the bob. Women now smoke. They drink. They have sex for fun, not for kids. I mean, definitely this whole perception of the woman kind of becomes a little bit more freer. And you also sort of see this in a lot of styles when you look at these images from Poland in the 1920s. You begin to see that influence coming in from Western Europe, coming in from America itself. So again, skirts go up to the knees. That was sexy, right? Because you're supposed to dress in Victorian style. So darker color dress and all the way to the bottom. If a guy saw your ankles, that's sexy. But now basically the skirt goes to the knee, and that kind of becomes a style. And again, I know this is far away, difficult to see, but if you zoom in, you sort of see this. You kind of really begin to see this influence of the Western Europe, of America, and you begin to see this also in Poland. You know, a lot of times I think people sort of see Poland as a different world, but you see a big influence coming in from these Western countries, ultimately. If anybody is interested in the history of women, definitely a lot of cool pictures. You know, I think today there's more and more interest in sort of looking at women in history. I think rightly so. This was really a topic ignored. And so you could definitely sort of see the role of women as nurses. Red Cross, the American Red Cross. Actually, this is an article I'll be writing in January. I just finished my research, and ultimately, you know, I'll be looking at Polish women enrolling in the American Red Cross and going into Poland in the 1920s. There was a lot of them, ultimately, who sort of did that. They begin to feel this sense of patriotism towards their countries, their people, even though they were never born in Poland. They never traveled to Poland. But yet they sort of begin to feel that. Women in uniform. This is actually a woman in uniform when Poland in 1939. Definitely women were in uniforms during World War II throughout. Again, like for example, Jadwiga, Pilsudski's daughter. But you see a lot of women really participating a lot during World War II, for crying out loud. Even the Queen, right, that just passed away in Britain. But again, you have a lot of these cool images. This is, for example, an image of the Treaty of Riga, which is cool because even in class, many times I talk about it to my students, but I never really sort of stopped to think about how this looked like. So this is kind of cool. I mean, this was sort of a treaty signed at the end of that war with Russia, with the Bolsheviks. And that sort of set that very shaky eastern border between Poland and Russia. But this is how it looked like. This is the end of that war with communism, with the Bolsheviks. So it kind of gives you a window into this. This image. City? Oświęcim. Kind of gives me goosebumps a little bit, but Oświęcim, during World War II, Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1 million people will die in the city. So how did the city look before all that tragedy? You know, and so it's kind of cool to sort of see that. I know the focus is here with the people and the president walking down the street, but I love to see the background and sort of visualize how these places, cities look like before we actually know of them, like Auschwitz, ultimately. Or even an image like that, which plays into my emotions of these kids playing in 1929. World War I begins, they'll be teenagers. They'll die. They'll be involved in killings, rapes, and all of everything that's going to follow, right? So I think later on, once you sort of even become a parent and you have your own kids, I mean, this really plays with emotions to sort of realize what's coming for these kids. Happy, joyful, playing around. And then the next few years, this whole world around them will come crashing down. And many times, their parents will die. Orphans. These are sort of Polish children, but these are orphans at the end of World War II. So their parents are either missing or dead. I mean, they could be missing because, again, a lot of Polish people were fighting across the world in Iran, in Iraq, sort of in Britain, in France. So, you know, you have to realize there was no Twitter, there is no YouTube, there is no, you know, cell phones or anything like that. So sometimes it took months for people to actually sort of see each other. And I mean, that's another thing that kind of blows my mind. The war is over. But, you know, you go back home to whatever it is that you could call a home because your home is not there no more. It's destroyed. And you're standing there. Is your husband alive? Where are your kids? Where's your mom? Right? There is no cell phone. There is no Skype. There is no computer. No one really that you can turn to for help. You know, these are going to be now stories at the end of World War II, which I think many times kind of people just overlook, and we talk about the Cold War and things like that. But it's really interesting to look at it. And this is the last one, and I made it in within an hour. Awesome. But there's also sort of a lot of these cool political images that you could sort of take a look at. This is, for example, taken with King of Afghanistan. So his name was Amanullah Khan, which is cool because ultimately then you could sort of think about other histories when you look at an image like this. Now, Amanullah is pretty interesting because he was the king of Afghanistan, from 1926 until 1929, when he left because of a civil war. However, in those 3 years, 1926 to 29, he really wanted to make Afghanistan a strong, independent nation that basically takes its examples from Western Europe. So for him, modernization equaled Westernization. He wanted to take the example of Britain, of France, even countries like Poland ultimately. But again, that flies in the face of a traditional Islamic values. And so what follows really is war among the tribes, and Afghanistan is going to become a mess till today. But I mean, you're looking also at somebody that you begin to wonder how different history would be if he stayed in power, ultimately in a place like Afghanistan. I mean, he's known for a few other things. Like, for example, in 1921 in Afghanistan, they really wanted to control sort of like the robbers and the bandits and things like that. So a common punishment would be ultimately to lock them up in a cage, high up on a pole, and leave them to die. So sort of leave them up like parrots. And they will stay there for a few days and eventually die of heat, exhaustion, and things like that. Fun stuff. But yeah, I mean, looking at these images, that's kind of how I see them. You know, first I see sort of Poland, I see Pilsudski, I see the people I'm looking at, but then sort of, because of my background, I cannot help to notice the details, the backgrounds, and sort of I begin to make these connections sort of with the Western world or Afghanistan. And by the way, not just Afghanistan, there's images of people coming in from Iran, from Iraq. There's McCarthy. So there's sort of American representatives coming into Poland in the 1930s. And all these images are digitalized, which I feel is pretty cool. So,